Today, Michelle Berklisich, Administrator for the State of California's Savings Plus program, will be moderating the webcast. We are very pleased and honored that she has agreed to be today's moderator. Now I'm going to turn things over to Michelle to get us started. Michelle, you may begin.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As mentioned, my name is Michelle Berklisich, and I will be the moderator for today's webcast. To all of you who have joined the webcast today, we want to thank you on behalf of NAGDA. The PowerPoint presentation for today's webcast has been posted to the NAGDA website. If you want to have a hard copy of the PowerPoint in front of you and have not yet downloaded it, you can access it on the NAGDA homepage at www.nagda.org and follow the links to the News and Events section located in the middle of the homepage. Next slide. We have a very short series of housekeeping announcements. First, NAGDA couldn't offer the 2013 NAGDCA series to participants without the financial support of our industry. So we'd like to thank all of our sponsors, who include Manning & Napier, Nationwide, Great West Retirement, ICMA-RC, Prudential Retirement, and VALIC. We are very grateful for the support of these industry sponsors. Next slide. Today's NAGDCast is worth one continuing education credit for INFRE CRC, CPE, and CFP designees. NAGDA will provide INFRE and the CFP board a list of all the participants. If you will be seeking credits, you must have registered with your contact information and be logged into the webcast using your information. Individuals from the same venue that will be seeking credits must all participate separately. That's very important. So again, if you want to get credits, you need to be listed under your login name. NAGDCast participants seeking CPE and CFP continuing education credits must complete the polling questions during the webcast to receive credit. Next slide. Finally, we really need your input on how we did with this webcast and what we can do to improve. So at the end, when you exit the webcast, a very quick, easy-to-answer NAGDCast evaluation will pop up. We ask that you take an additional 2 to 3 minutes to complete this survey so we can determine if we're on the right track with these programs. Next slide. Our speakers for today's program are Stephen Montagna, who is the Program Manager for the City of Los Angeles Deferred Compensation Plan, and Ben Taylor, the Vice President and Defined Contribution Consultant at Callan Associates. With that said, let's get to today's agenda. Today's webcast will give you an overview of the Plan Administration section of the NAGDA's Best Practice Guide. Next slide. So before we get started, let's talk about a best practice. What is a best practice? A best practice is a method or a technique that has consistently shown results superior to those achieved by other means and is typically used as a benchmark. In addition, a best practice can evolve to become better as improvements are discovered. Best practice is considered by some as a business term to describe the process of developing and following a standard way of doing things that multiple organizations can use. Best practices are used to maintain quality as an alternate to mandatory legislative standards and can be used based on self-assessment or benchmarking. The Best Practice Guidebook was designed to serve as a model for plans to use as a guide in administering their DC plans. So today's presentation, we will focus on the Plan Administration chapter of the guidebook. Although processes may differ based upon the size of your plan and the organizational structure of your plan, our presentation will provide you with recommendations that are based upon practical knowledge obtained from NAGDA members, including plan sponsors, consultants, and industry providers. The goal is to provide you with practices that promote greater efficiency, result in improved outcomes, are clear and explainable, apply across multiple plan types, and are measurable. Next slide. So today, Stephen and Ben are going to cover some of the critical aspects in administering your plans. First, they're going to talk about what it takes to set up your plan. Then we're going to get into the authoritative documents. These are documents that are really critical in setting up and administering your plan to ensure that you're in compliance with the Internal Revenue Code and the other state requirements. And then they're going to get into key services that are required to administer a plan, including record keeping, trustee custody services, administration, investments and communications. Each of these components are critical in administering your defined contribution plan. Additionally, we'll address the use of third-party consultants in setting up and running your plans. As I indicated before, this information has been gathered together by various NAGDA members. All the plan sponsors that are involved in NAGDA are of different sizes. So as we indicated, some of these things that they're going to talk about today are ideas and practices that have been used, and we hope that it helps you all to set up your plans better and that we can answer any questions that you have along the way. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ben to discuss plan setup.
Well, good morning for some and good afternoon for the rest of the country. For all who are trying to identify voices, this is Ben Taylor, and it's a pleasure to speak to you all today. Thank you so much. Next slide, please, by the way. So, again, I want to just remind everyone who's on the call today that we're talking about one of the chapters of the Best Practice Guide, and I want to spend some time just very briefly selling the Best Practice Guide. This is one of several chapters. There are quite a few pieces of the plan and things that you may encounter in your day-to-day governing the plan that are available in that Best Practice Guide, and I think NAGDA as an organization is very happy about it as a resource. So strongly encourage everyone to, if you enjoy this, dive into the rest of the guide and see the wealth of information that's there for you. We're pretty happy with it. So with that said, let's take a start by looking at the different types of plans that you can have available to you. So there's quite a few different types of plans that you can have, and they're often paired together. So the most common type of defined contribution plan that people refer to, and I'm sure all of us probably deal with 457 plans most that are on this call, but at the same time, people who refer to us in our private lives or otherwise are going to say, oh yeah, they work in 401k plans. The dominant private sector plan subject to ERISA. Nowadays, there aren't many 401k plans that are in the public sector space because they've been grandfathered in since no longer being allowed as new plans for the public sector. But they are both ERISA and non-ERISA 401k plans, and in particular, several large states have maintained 401k plans that were founded some decades ago. 401k plans, just like 457B plans and 403B plans, are employee deferral plans primarily, and so they function with the same 17,500 limits that you would see elsewhere. A 457B plan has some slightly more advantageous provisions than you would have for a 401k plan. In particular, some of the 10% early withdrawal penalties are relaxed in some circumstances for the 457 plan. Otherwise, they function very, very similarly, and they also don't have as many testing requirements as you would see in the ERISA world. These are predominantly available for government plans. If you're going to start a new deferred compensation plan today for a government plan, you're probably going to be starting a 457 plan, unless you are an educational, healthcare, or religious institution, in which case you're very likely to be a 403B plan sponsor. So 403B plan sponsors, for example, are often universities, K-12 school districts, municipal and religious and private for-profit healthcare systems, hospitals, for example. And all of these are frequently paired with 401A plans. 401A plans have different limits for contributions. Those limits are actually much higher than is the case for the three plans at the top. And they're often used for employer discretionary contributions. So for example, you can have a standard benefit as a percentage of pay put into your 401A plan. A participant would direct the monies, but they would not be taking that out as a percentage of their pay. Whereas with a 401K, 457B, or 403B plan, typically speaking, you would be having just employee deferrals rather than employer discretionary deferrals. So it's just a basic overview of the types of plans that are available. We'll move on to the next slide. And with respect to authoritative documents, we have a basic list here, and I want to see if Stephen, you want to take a jump in at these?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Stephen Montagna. This is sort of a handy list for you to think about when administering your plan. These are documents that you could consider part of where you would go to get answers, where you would go to sort of be able to establish policy. So at the very top of the list would be the Internal Revenue Code. Obviously, that's and that along with Treasury regulations are really what would be used to govern what you can do and what you cannot do with your particular plan. Sort of the next level down is for individual entities. There would typically be some type of legal authority for actually creating the plan. So, as an example, you know, if you are a local government entity, the legal authority might be some type of ordinance that was passed by your city council. So this is basically this kind of a document is what's used to basically say who's in charge of what the expectations are, and where the rules can be found. Coming down to the next level would be the plan document, and the plan document is different, is typically different in that what it's really doing is laying out the specific rules for the plan that you offer. So there are certain choices that plan sponsors can make as to how they're going to be administering their program. So as an example, in a 457 plan, a plan sponsor has the option of offering loans and hardships. They don't have to do it, but if they're going to do it, the information about that would be contained within the plan document. One of the things to be aware of with your plan document is that in terms of a best practice is to make sure that you look at it regularly, and that you sort of, what you're checking for is to make sure that the way that you're administering the plan is consistent with the plan document, because it's actually pretty easy to set up the rules for your plan, but then over time you might develop certain practices which can sort of end up being inconsistent, and that can be a problem. And some cases it means you need to change the practice, and in some cases it means that you would need to update the plan document. And Ben, maybe you might want to talk about setting up the investment policy.
Absolutely. And before I do, I'll add a couple of little comments about what you said, and thanks for covering that in such depth. Just to break it down in very simple terms, there's federal authority and federal code that set kind of the boundaries of what you can create for your plan, and then there's the creation of the plan, which is going to be specific to whatever local government you're talking about, or whoever is in charge where you are. It could be state, could be city, could be both. There's often statutory authority for the plan, and sometimes for state and city plans, the rules are actually also statutory. So sometimes you have an issue with the plan document negotiating between what's in statute and what's in the rules. But the key takeaway I would say for a plan document is, as Stephen has already said, first, make sure that your plan document reflects the reality of how you're governing your plan. Few things could be as unfortunate as to document one process and perform another. However, even more unfortunate than that is not to have anything that governs your plan in writing and in a routine, referenceable, complete fashion. This is the way that you keep all your providers and all the people who deal with your plan on the same page, and you maintain written institutional memory. This is the consistency check that coordinates between record keeper, trustee, custodian, investment manager, communications people, your website, the internal people at the sponsoring organization. The plan document is really a central point of contact and the Bible, if you will, for how the plan is run. So it's very, very important to make sure that that's maintained on a routine basis, and that it's also something that is fairly comprehensive to reflect your plan. Now, with respect to an investment policy statement, there are a couple of ways to construct them. I think the most important thing to do is to keep at top of mind what's valuable about an investment policy statement. When you're using a committee, as is typically the case, and is also perceived as a best practice to govern the plan's investments, there can be a temptation to have many different viewpoints or just the nature of whoever wins the day's discussion to make investment decisions. But you're acting as a fiduciary with other people's money. And when you want to have that responsibility discharged appropriately and most prudently, the best thing to do is to have a documented process that details exactly what criteria are going to be used for monitoring, the frequency, as well as how funds are changed and why. If you set up an investment policy statement that provides a documented due diligence process, you can follow that much like the plan document in your investment overview. It's a routine process that everyone can sign on to, that everyone can point to, and hopefully will be set up in such a way that as you do your monitoring, you also have written documentation of the fact that you've been exercising that due diligence and following that investment policy. So this is something that keeps everyone on the same page and following a routine process, and it also provides a template for providing due diligence to ensure that you have a written record of the fact that you're governing your plan in a consistent and prudent fashion. So typically speaking, an investment policy statement will specify things such as the funds, benchmarks for the funds, frequency for performance evaluation, method of performance evaluation, and the responsibility of various entities that will be serving the plan. That will include the money managers, any consultants that you may employ, the record keeper, and the board, and the committee members, as well as staff, just to make sure that everyone knows what their roles are and how they're to participate in governing the plan and making investment changes, as well as investment monitoring. One other thing that I'd say, if you don't mind, Stephen, for talking about some of these optional pieces that we have listed at the bottom. We talked about governing body bylaws. Those are often referenced in the investment policy statement as well. There's frequently something like a board or committee charter that specifies delegation of responsibility between, for example, the primary plan sponsor and committees or subcommittees. So, for example, there's often an overall board and then an investment subcommittee. So sometimes when you do that, you want to have bylaws that specify who's in charge of what and who's empowered to do what. Another one that I think is very, very helpful that is somewhat underutilized is a strategic plan. Now, with a strategic plan, you can keep the plan from staff, board, committee, as well as your service providers. This includes consultants, your record keeper predominantly, any communication, education staff, investment managers, and the rest on the same page, focusing on achievements for your plan. That could be increasing enrollment, that could be increasing diversification, that could be improving certain administrative functions like the time to get statements out to people. But if you adopt a strategic plan, you have an ongoing schedule of due diligence and a method of monitoring achievement towards certain measurable goals. And that will combat the tendency for inertia to leave certain parts of the plan unreviewed for lengthy periods of time, or to accept the status quo as acceptable. This keeps you driving forward and keeps all service providers on their toes, making sure that they're putting their best foot forward. And so if you don't have one, I'd recommend that you consider the potential for adopting a strategic plan, because it does have the potential to keep everyone moving in the same and appropriate direction. I believe at this point we have a question, a polling question for the group, and that should be displayed on the right-hand side. So while that's up there, I encourage all those who are participating to participate in the polling question. And while we're doing that, I'll see if Stephen has any commentary or corrections, or if Michelle would like to dive in on some of the comments we've made so far.
Well, one of the things I just wanted to share very quickly on both of these optional documents is we certainly have learn through the process that we went through what the importance of these can be. So as an example, when we're talking about bylaws, you know, sometimes if you're working with a committee, in the absence of those, when some type of issue comes up, you might end up deferring to something like Robert's Rules of Order, which we sort of learned the hard way can be problematic, and that's why it can be really valuable to basically think through some of those procedural issues before you actually have to deal with them on some issue that, you know, might be contentious. And the other is on the strategic plan. We certainly have found the process to be extremely useful, primarily for thinking down the road, really thinking, you know, where is the plan going to be, you know, maybe in 5 years or 10 years' time. It just brings up lots of interesting questions that are better to think of now, you know, rather than waiting till those things come up on you later on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. I think another thing that's very helpful about a strategic plan is that it's a more formal version of what I think many of the folks who will be on the phone will know. Many folks will be experiencing this kind of, oh, you know, in 2 years I should probably have an RFP coming out for my record keeper, but I may need to change some of my investments, or maybe I should look at record keeper and trustee and custodian at the same time. If you maintain a strategic sequencing of those contract renewals and what you have as top priorities, projects that can often take many months won't all bunch up together. Or if they are bunched up together and that's how you want to run it, it can happen because you've prepared for it and you've set aside time and resources and timing to best manage the process. And that can be much easier on staff and can lead to a much more regimented, clear, well-functioning process, as long as you exercise a lot of due diligence and foresight. And strategic plans can be very helpful in bringing that top of mind. And so with that, I think we're moving on to the next slide.
Okay. So what we listed here are sort of the basic service areas that in the plan sponsor role you would want to be paying attention to. So if we can start at the bottom, and if you think of you know, look at record keeping and then looking at the custody trustee function. These are functions which are very important to the plan. From the participant perspective, they may not be very visible, so they may not see this going on, but they're basically the basic infrastructure of what makes the plan work, and we're going to be going through these in each of the subsequent slides. The next level is more visible, certainly to the participant, and that's what on the left, the administration is sort of what the rules are, what the rules of the road are, how the plan actually operates from the participant perspective, and then of course what the investment menu is, so what investments participants have to choose from. And then at the very top would be the category, which we'll also be talking about later, of basically how participants are interpreting the information that you're giving them. So if you can kind of think of communications as really being at the top of the list, in the sense that it's the intersection of where how the plan actually operates at the point at which the plan participant actually interacts with it and is going to be making certain choices, and so we'll definitely be talking more about that a little bit later on. And I think we can push on to the next slide.
So here we're going to talk about record keeping, which I'm sure is everyone's favorite topic, by which I mean it's the topic that we all interface with that is not too interesting to most. There's many things you can say about record keeping, but I think one of the most fundamental comments you can make about record keeping is really that it is kind of the backbone of the plan. As was kind of referred to in the prior slide, it's often only semi-visible or really the secondary aspects of record keeping are visible, and those being things like voice response unit, communication staff, website, things like that. But really, if your participants experience difficulties working with their plan, getting their statements on time, getting statements that make sense, knowing where their balances are, things like that, it's usually going to derive from how well things are maintained in record keeping. So what do I mean by record keeping? Well, most fundamentally it means keeping track of things like participant accounts, balances, contributions, loans, hardships, applications for new enrollment, requests for disbursements, things like hardship withdrawals, loans, retirement, distributions in retirement, all those sorts of things. So record keeping is really the blocking and tackling, the nuts and bolts, the machine that keeps your plan working together. So there are a couple different options for record keeping, and there are some plans that will make the brave step, or oftentimes I think they actually previously made the brave step a long time ago of trying to internally record keep. As you can see here from the very basic graphic, sometimes it's fun to bake a loaf of bread in your kitchen, but it's a lot harder to fill a bakery in the same fashion. And there is significant advantage, particularly as technology advances with computers and the internet and the rest, to work with organizations that have significant expertise and scalable infrastructure for record keeping and all the ancillary services that come with that. So while record keeping purely refers to keeping those files, making sure that we know where participant accounts and monies are, there's a lot more that will go with it. So for example, reporting to the plan sponsor on what people are doing, coming to understand your plan, using it as a database, audit support, providing a call center or call center access, direct education, on-site reps, a website that allow your participants to interact with your plan, see information, transact. There's all sorts of other educational features that can be pushed out through all the different touch points. One thing that's very important, I think, as well when you're talking about record keeping that isn't always a high visibility item is disaster recovery. So for example, if you have an internal record keeping process, it's very important to make sure that if there's a snowstorm or a hurricane or any other type of natural disaster or other disruption in your area, that those files are not lost, those files are protected, and those files are backed up, and the plan can be interacted with and operational from multiple locations. And that's really one of the best things about some of the well-developed record-keeping organizations is a robust disaster recovery and multiple data center operation. So I think that's one that if you haven't taken a good look at for your current provider, maybe that's something to investigate and make sure it works well. So just a basic discussion of what is record keeping, what are some of the advantages. It definitely can work for internal record keeping, but increasingly there are advantages as the core record keeper will somewhat dictate who you can work with for all those other touch points as well. And there's a lot out there that you can take advantage of as plan sponsors. Stephen, any commentary you'd like to make on that as well, or Michelle? And otherwise, I think we have a second polling question.
I wanted to
polling questions open.
On the
Go ahead.
questions, that if you're seeking CPE or CFP credits, that it's important that you complete all the polling questions. So just a reminder there.
And given that we're saying this on the second question, I'll apologize to all for having not introduced that the first time.
Well, I introduced it at the beginning, so you're good then.
Thank you, Michelle. So those are just some of my basic comments on internal and external record keeping, but I've worked with clients that have certainly done both. But I think overall, just to reiterate, it's very important to think about how the choice of any one vendor will result in choices that echo in terms of who else you can work with, from voice response unit to call center to website to trust and custody, communication, education, or even one of the most fundamental choices, how much investment flexibility do you have with respect to what you offer in your core menu. So while record keeping itself is something that requires its own set of due diligence criteria, it's also very important to make sure that you look at the impact of it more broadly. It looks like we have a very interesting mix of people. Almost 17% have a combination in-house or self-administered plan. Very interesting. I think it's time for us to move on to the next slide. And Stephen, were you going to take over here?
Well, actually, I think we're going to have you go first.
I'm sorry, pardon me.
Yeah.
All right, so excuse me for misunderstanding our agreement on that earlier. So with custody and trustee relationships, I have to say, first off, this is one of my favorite slides because I'm a huge dog lover, and one of them appears to be a pit bull, which I have. But there's a couple of different things that the custodian and the trustee will do, and I think that these are two of the terms that are most often conflated and therefore not entirely understood when we're dealing with vendors to a plan. So fundamentally, a custodian is effectively a holder of the assets. And we're going to make sure that they're providing certain operational functions. And so they're there to make sure they're safeguarding the plan assets. So these are typically banks of some kind. There's other things that they can do, however, that can be more active. So taking a look at the bottom, you see a passive trustee. They're just protecting plan assets as they flow in and out of the plan. They're not exercising discretion. They're not taking control. They're just there making sure that the asset flows are functioning as they should and making sure that they're keeping track of the plan assets. Now, a fund custodian can also hold plan assets. It can be where the record keeper is actually locating the assets that they're directing movements to and from. But they're also going to be dealing with things like payroll transfers, distributions, rollovers into the plan, a host of other money movement functions. So they're going to be working with a record keeper. They're not always the same as the record keeper. So very frequently they can work with external custodians and record keepers. So also, you can have a fund custodian that can do things, and this is often the case for larger plans, like unitizing separate accounts. So instead of having a mutual fund, an annuity, or a collective investment trust, a custodian can also do things like strike units of an account that's managed specifically for your plan, rather than investing in a vehicle that is more broadly accessible. And you get a little bit more complicated in custodian functions when you move up to things like master custodian, when they're both providing unitization services as well as specialized administrative functions. For example, taking those unitized assets and making additional unitization from them, or dealing with, for example, international holdings of an equity stock, things like that. So not every plan is going to require that degree of custodian operation. Typically speaking, larger plans are the ones that are going to require more complicated custodian functions. But in general, you're going to have both a custodian and a trustee, and they may be the same, they may be slightly different, but you need them to be there to provide the safeguard for plan assets and to make sure that the assets are held in trust on behalf of their participants for whom they're invested.
Ben, thanks. And one just very general thing that I wanted to add in here is that when discussions around custodians and trustees are happening, it's very important that you sort of make sure that the people, the vendors, the entities that you're working with are actually that you understand the language that they're using and what they mean when they're using the term. I say this because we certainly had, for some internal reasons, we were exploring making certain changes, what was coming out of that was that basically different players understood these terms to be meaning different things, and so the first thing that we had to really do was to clarify and to sort of give them the language, give them the terms, and make sure that we were all on the same page. And that included investment managers, that included third-party administrators, it included board members. So it's just helpful even if you don't sort of need or haven't necessarily mastered all these right now at this moment. The important part is when you're having the discussion to be really clear about what the language means. And I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay. So here we're going to introduce this concept of bundled versus unbundled arrangements within your plan. So the bundling concept basically means that you as the plan sponsor are working with a single provider to provide virtually all or all of the major service categories. And so in that arrangement, what that would typically mean is it's one vendor who's not only doing the administrative and record-keeping work, but they're also running the investment options. The unbundled model basically means that you are working with multiple vendors, but they're actually performing different functions. So in general, unbundling provides opportunities to create greater efficiencies within the plan, and that can end up lowering costs. The reason for that is that vendors then are typically competing on narrower playing fields, but this isn't always the case. The relative value of either method that you're using can be driven by asset size. So quite often you'll see smaller plans that will be keeping their programs bundled, and as they get larger, they realize that they can realize greater efficiencies, and so at that point they would be unbundling. So as an example, with the City of LA, we actually began in 1983 with working with two different vendors that were offering basically bundled products, and then it wasn't until 1999 that we actually unbundled the plan, what that meant was that the third-party administrator was chosen through one process, and then all of the investment managers would be chosen through a separate process. Ben, did you have anything to add on this?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think with bundling, there's more than just the cost issue that's at stake. Really, the way to think about bundling is, first of all, the term is a little bit vague because people will say, are you a bundled plan or are you an unbundled plan? And sometimes we mean, is your record keeper the same as your investment management menu? And well, sometimes maybe it's 50% the same, sometimes it's 100%. But also there's bundling with respect to the custodial services and trustee services, as well as record keeping. So there's a lot of different ways that you can have a bundled or partially bundled or an entirely bundled plan. Typically speaking, smaller plans that are going to have maybe 50 or 100 or several hundred employees are going to work with bundling for a host of reasons, including simply the complexity and cost of oversight and multiple RFPs. But with that said, with bundling, one of the biggest concerns you're going to have is if you have very little choice with respect to who's providing each of the services, they have separate due diligence criteria. So if you have provider X providing all of your services, investment management, trust and custody, and record keeping, it may be that they have trouble with their record keeping service, or their investment managers all have their portfolio managers quit, and there's maybe a need to engage in a search. That's the point at which operational efficiency can then run into a challenge with respect to fiduciary oversight. And so I think one of the key insights is to keep in mind that the note on the bottom is important. No one is the best at everything. So while there are operational efficiencies that have an impact, the second piece is that there's the oversight that you have to provide for each and every one of these individual categories. So as you look to grow your plan, as you have those opportunities, consider also the separation of fiduciary oversight as one of the benefits of looking at each one of these functions separately, because you can clarify exactly how you're focusing on each and every service category rather than having to make trade-offs, which are sometimes difficult, and documenting the decision-making rationale is also sometimes difficult when you admit that maybe one provider isn't the best at something that you like, but you're going to pick them anyway because of the other benefits. Those trade-offs don't have clear and straightforward rules.
Okay.
And with that, I think we have one more polling question. Michelle, while we're at it, I know the way your plan is structured, you may have some comments on bundling in your experience. Do you have anything that you'd like to add in there, or can maybe speak a little bit to your plan's experience while running through the polling question?
Certainly. Yeah, much like Stephen's plan, we started out as a bundled plan several years ago where our record keeper was providing the majority of our investment funds. But we learned over time that really it provided us with much more control over all of our providers to separate these services. In addition, it also provides a lot more transparency to the plan and to the participants in the plan as far as costs are concerned and fees, and it gives the plan sponsor much more control over monitoring and keeping the fees low, as well as control over the funds themselves. When you're in a bundled arrangement, it's much more difficult to change your underlying fund managers because you're all tied together into one contract. By decoupling those things and unbundling the plan, you have much more flexibility, and it's easier to follow your investment policy statement as far as monitoring the performance of your investment managers. And in the case of with larger plans, it gives you the opportunity to move into things like separate accounts and not be tied into retail mutual funds and institutional funds.
Great, and it looks like we have our responses. So we have an interesting group here. It looks like maybe some larger plans, since 60% are unbundled. All right, so shall we move forward to the next slide and try and be watchful of time?
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry, Ben, that's you.
Yeah, I was going to let you have it if you wanted. So on investments, just a couple key things. We can't tell you which mutual fund is going to do best or anything like that with respect to investments. But one of the key insights with respect to investments, and this is very, very simple, and that's kind of the lesson, is simplicity produces more favorable outcomes. Some of my most favorite facts about defined contribution plans is that irrespective of how many funds you offer in your plan menu, you're going to have participants use about 3 of them. It doesn't really matter if you offer 50 or if you offer 10, they're going to use about 3. And the more you offer, the more the actual utilization of the plan declines. Savings rates, as well as the number of people who participate in the plan, will decline. They will save less of their money, and fewer of them will save if you start significantly expanding investment options. So best practices are typically somewhere between 10 and 20 investment choices, and that usually counts target date fund suites, by the way, as one choice, not as the 10 or 12 that they frequently are of individual funds. So it's very important to resist the temptation to allow participants to have their retirement plan basically be a shopping service where they say, I'd really like a Japanese distressed debt fund, if you wouldn't mind. You have to resist those temptations and think that any and every investment decision you make is following the 80-20 rules for the 80% rather than for the 20% that are more likely to be vocal.
Right, and I just wanted to add, just you know, kind of from the plan sponsor perspective, or one plan sponsor, we actually went through a process recently of trying to reduce the number of core options, and we followed some research indicating that once you hit approximately 12 options, that's kind of the point where participants end up making worse decisions around asset allocation. So our menu now is 12 options, and that includes all 5 of the risk-based asset allocation funds that we have. So we think that that's definitely helped to keep things simpler for plan participants.
Great.
So I think we can go on to the next slide, which is communications, and this is favorite topic of mine. It's certainly something that we really emphasize here in the City of LA. It's easy when the plan sponsor is looking at this, particularly if when you're working with vendors, to basically kind of deal with this as an afterthought and sort of use information and certain communication pieces that have been used in lots of other areas. And I think what I feel really passionately about in this area is that this is something that, in my view, really belongs at the top of the list. This is, as we mentioned earlier, this is the point at which people actually interpret the plan, and it really does matter how they're actually they're taking the information and the choices and interpreting that information and then making decisions. So number one, most important, is to as a best practice is to actually test your materials before you actually use them. We routinely do focus groups in our plan, and I can tell you there isn't one communication piece that we have used that did not sort of really radically change or in very important ways change as a result of the feedback that we got through the focus groups. Because you may think that the way that the information, you might have your own ideas about how it's being interpreted, but your participants will actually tell you this is the way that we're actually interpreting it, and that might be very different. I guess the other point is that it's also easy when working with vendors that there's certain requirements for disclosure, and certainly certain regulatory requirements need to be followed. But I think it's also important that you make sure that you can observe how participants are actually whether that information can end up getting in the way of the most important things that they need to understand. Ben, is there anything to add, or do you want to go on to the final slide?
I was just going to add too that one of the key parts of communicating is addressing your audience and knowing that your audience is very broad-based, and that you have to try and reach the various generations with different methods. Not everybody wants to get a piece of paper in the mail, or not everybody wants to read an email. So it's really important to do some analysis and study to determine what's most effective for various generations.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't have anything to add to communications other than to say, when possible, if communications is the easy way out and for trying to drive participant behavior, it's always worth exploring with communications and things that you can do outside the box, including using plan defaults. So they're also extremely effective. So good to pair plan conditions with communications when possible as well to get the desired impact. And I think we're ready for the next slide.
So with consultants, I think the idea here is that there are areas where you're going to need expert help. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's it's valuable to identify those areas of plan administration where you think you might need help, and then go out there and make sure that you have the resources that you need to get your job done. So certainly at the top of that list would be investments. Most plan sponsors typically don't have those resources in-house, so you would want to go outside to be able to get resources to help you monitor your investments, go through your investment procurements. You may also find it valuable to use a consultant to help in the process of basically looking at the administration of the plan as well as doing procurements for those services. Some areas can be very, particularly in the record-keeping arena, can be very technical, and it can be valuable for you to have an outside consultant for that. And then these last three that are listed are probably they're not as typically used, but many plan sponsors do use them. So, for example, you You might go outside for a communications resource that would be separate from your third-party administrator. You may want to have some type of tax counsel resource that you don't have in-house. And then there are certain plans that will also use outside auditors to basically look at the books and to make sure that the record-keeping process is operating soundly. Ben, anything to add there? Or Michelle?
I would just say that when you're dealing with consultants, the consultant is a term that can be appended to many. So I would say as you do so, please look carefully at the interest of all, and independence is to be prized. But I would say that all your comments are strongly echoed, although I have to give the disclosure, I am a consultant, so I agree with this as well.
And Stephen, too, I agree wholeheartedly that consultants have really benefited our plan. I think with the larger plans, typically you have a little bit more revenue to deal with, so we can afford the ability to utilize some of those resources. And in developing your plan lineup and, looking at what types of funds to offer and, getting into more complex structures, I think it's really been helpful to have consultants involved in those decisions, as well as the tax counsel. We use our tax counsel a lot, although we have a plan document that's really our guiding document. What you'll find is that you run into, communication and interpretation issues on how the record keeper is to interpret the plan document, and so you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is in compliance with your plan document and with the Internal Revenue Code. So in those types of situations, an external counsel comes in really handy.
Okay, so I think, do we move on to questions now?
Certainly. So now this portion of the presentation is devoted to the question and answers portion. So I'm going to ask the WebEx event coordinator, Caroline, if she'll review the instructions for asking questions. Caroline?
At this time, we'd like to remind you that you may submit questions through your web console. Simply locate the question and answer panel on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in the open area and click Send to submit.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay, so I'll be watching the monitor here as the questions roll in. So our first question we have, I will read. It says, if a plan sponsor currently offers a bundled plan and people are happy with it, but you think that the fees are too high, is it better to try and get them to reduce their fees, or is it better to try and unbundle the plan? Stephen, you want to talk about that one?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think both avenues can be explored. So, it never hurts. It's always useful to go to your third-party administrator and ask them about reducing fees. But it can be also helpful to at least begin the process of exploring what the plan would look like if it was unbundled. And as an example, that was the process that we employed. Beginning in 1995, we actually began working with a consultant to look at what would happen if we were to unbundle. And that process, just by sort of starting the process and asking the question, that did end up resulting in lower fees from the incumbent administrators we were working with until we eventually, 4 years later, completed all of the work in running the procurements.
And if I may, I'd just say one very brief comment on that. Two things. Number one, if you don't have consultant help, seek it out, would be my recommendation. Number two, one thing you can do with a smaller plan is get your fees specified in a per-person cost, as opposed to what is often the case in a bundled plan where you have revenue sharing that's coming from those plan options. One of the big challenges you get if you have both investment management and record keeping and trust custody that are on the same provider is you get a negotiation once you try to change an investment manager because you feel you have a fiduciary need to do so. If you have pricing separated from investment management, then in theory they should be ambivalent about what your investment choices are, even though that's still part of your requirement to have a certain percentage. And it makes it a little bit easier to make those changes, because otherwise you would have revenue impact from changing from one fund to another, even if they have multiple options that are within their fund family.
Okay, I'll go ahead and go on to the next question. The vendor says they can't produce a draft without running through compliance legal. So how can you get the draft out to a focus group? So I guess this is dealing with communications.
Right. So I would still think in that instance that the vendor hopefully can at least give the plan sponsor the information so that they can look at it, so that you don't have to wait till they run through their legal review to be able to work with the information. And as the plan sponsor, you certainly have the right. It's not required that you're actually involving the vendor in the process of conducting the focus group and being able to get information back from plan participants on that information.
So Stephen, are you saying that you would put together a draft communication, share it with the peer group, get their feedback, and then provide it to your EPA for their compliance review?
Right. I mean, I would certainly urge them, the vendor, to go through its compliance legal review at the very end of the process, and would absolutely insist on being able to work with the draft document to look at it, and then to be able to conduct my own focus group.
Okay, thank you. So the next question says, where or when can I find the new required participant fee disclosure format? Ben, can you want to take that one?
Sure. So the disclosure format is actually something that applies principally to ERISA plans. And I can say that there's a lot of information that's available from the Department of Labor website. However, probably the best thing to do is just to ask your provider for their written materials and how they would do that. They're the 404A5 and 408B2 disclosures I think you're referring to, and in both cases those are not technically required in the same fashion for non-ERISA plans. However, they do have template disclosures at nearly every provider, so I would ask them for their general template to see what it looks like, but also be aware that if you're a non-ERISA plan, like most NAGDA members, you may have some latitude in how you'd want to display your fees, and it may be worth considering exercising some of that latitude, because the current environment is long and somewhat confusing.
Getting to the top of the hour, I have, I think, time for one more question. So it says here, we have an open architect of investments with our record keeper, which allows the committee to choose whatever investments we want for the plan. Do you consider this a bundled plan or an unbundled plan?
You know, I would say very generally, it's an unbundled plan. It can be somewhat restricted if, for example, you have open architecture, but you still have certain restrictions where you have to have a certain percentage with the plan record keeper, for example, or if you don't have too much in the way of options within their platform. But yes, broadly speaking, that's considered an unbundled plan, even if you do have some of the record keeper's options on your menu. As long as they're not contractually required for your pricing to be in place, then it's considered unbundled by most.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to both Ben and Stephen. We are now at the end of our time, but I'd like to remind everybody to please complete the NAGDCA evaluation. So once you exit out of the event, the evaluation will pop up on your screen. In addition, within the next 7 or so business days, the program will be archived on the NAGDA website for access for today's participants. So thank you all so much for taking the time to participate in our NAGDCast today, and many thanks to all the speakers for sharing their time and expertise. So thank you very much, and you guys have a great week.
Thank you again for joining us today. This concludes today's webcast, and you may now disconnect.